Thanks very much. The discussion, I think, is very interesting, and I particularly welcome the evidence from Vincent de Paul and the ESRI. But I go back to what Deputy Chambers said earlier on about priority recommendation number 3 from Chapter 6 that we worked hard and long hours to get agreement on, which was that this government would conduct a poverty review, a fuel poverty review. Can you just please answer me yes or no that you have ignored that? Instead of obfuscating, as you did in 2 or 3 PQs which I've given you over the summer, please give the public a yes or no answer that you're not and had no intentions of conducting a poverty review. I then want to ask you about priority recommendation number 4 from the same chapter. And that priority recommendation, you may tell me now if you've done anything about it, was that the Department of Finance commission an inquiry into the revenue that could be realised through the introduction of a carbon tax on the profits of corporations and firms directly linked to the production and sale of gas, oil, coal and other related fossil fuels. Have you any intention of conducting that inquiry and trying to establish how you could ring-fence profits on industry for dealing with climate change? I want to ask the RSI, if you get a chance here, to repeat those figures you gave us on how energy poverty is measured and when you move from one band to another. I'm particularly fascinated by the figure, depending on the criteria you use, that energy poverty among retired single people moves from a low percentage right up to 42.8%, because that's my experience as a local TD. My clinic is packed every day with pensioners trying to access the grants that I'm being told are available, warmer home schemes, retrofitting and all the rest of it. It isn't there for a lot of pensioners who may be in receipt of a tiny occupation-related pension. It isn't there for pensioners who are in receipt of fuel allowance but don't suffer from COPD or a lung-related disease. They may be crippled with arthritis, they may be going blind and be freezing cold all the time, but they're not getting any help. They're told not to even bother applying when it comes to schemes that are supposed to help them to alleviate. They're worried about the increase in carbon tax. It does incentivise them to say, I'd love to get new windows, I'd love to get solar panels, I'd love to get the house retrofitted. They cannot access it, and they don't have the 40 or 50 grand up front to say, there's my contribution to doing up my home, now give it back to me. It doesn't work like that. There is a cohort of Middle Ireland caught in the middle, and it includes, very critically, the travelling population, and the Traveller Mabs carried out very serious research into this. Very critically, lone parents, pensioners, working people who are on low pay, of which most working people are in this country. So we are witnessing a farcical exercise where we're told by Mr Jerry Kenny there his job is to raise revenue through indirect taxation, and then we hear from the others that there's no real facilities there to help people who are going to be impacted by this carbon tax. And yet I'll just remind all the members of the committee that the vast majority of this committee recommended a carbon tax. And one question to the Department of Finance. We don't know what the Minister is going to put the carbon tax up by, but let's say he put it up by a fiver a tonne. Would I be right in saying that that would raise about 108 million? Or if he put it up by a tenner a tonne, that would raise 216 million. And how far do you think that is going to go to help the most vulnerable people change their behaviour, improve their lives and get them out of fuel poverty? Seriously. And will you please undertake that exercise that priority recommendation 4 asked you to do? Look at how we can tax the profits of the fossil fuel and related industries, ring-fence that tax so that they don't pass it on to the poor again, and use it to undo the damage that they've done to the climate and to the planet.
Will I bring in Mr Collins first?
Thank you, Deputy. So just in relation to the query about the review, the recommendation by the committee on the reviewing the extent and nature of fuel poverty and also the most appropriate measure. At the outset, I gave a very brief summary of the opening statement, and the opening statement explains that a review of fuel poverty was undertaken by the department in 2016. More recently, then, a similar study was carried out again to give an estimate of fuel poverty. So there are 2 studies have been taken place already, so that, and the ESRI is the most recent one. And in terms of the issue of what is identifying the most appropriate measure, I also outlined that in my opening statement that we are, along with the SEAI, we are working with the CSO, the State National Statistics Agency, who are best placed to inform us and use their expertise in terms of identifying the most appropriate measure to be used in that for fuel poverty, which will further inform policy developments and developments of our schemes.
I'm still not getting an answer.
Yeah.
And it's real problematic and I've asked you these questions in writing and I've got nothing back but obfuscation. Are you going to conduct a review of fuel poverty in this country or not? You haven't done it, we know that. Are you going to?
What we would suggest kind of covered the extent of fuel poverty was covered by the ESRI study, and I don't know whether they wanted to say anything on that. They used a similar methodology that was used in the 2016 study. So using the current measure of fuel poverty, that was published in the report of June by the ESRI.
You had other questions for...
I didn't ask the RSI, I asked the department.
You had other...
We gave this recommendation as a climate action committee across all parties, and it's been utterly and totally ignored. And yet the recommendation to increase the carbon tax was contingent on that review.
Well, the department would never, well, we wouldn't generally undertake that kind of detailed analytical work ourselves. We would generally outsource it. The 2016 review was outsourced to another, it was a consultancy firm on that occasion. But we rely on the expertise of outside organisations such as the ESRI and the CSO.
And just to add as well, it's because the expertise of the ESRI is in its databases and understanding the socioeconomic impacts, and to be able to understand the different income groups within society as well. So they're best placed to carry out that work. So as I said, that a study was undertaken in 2016, and another study has been completed by the ESR in 2019. But we are continuing the work, and we're working with the CSO, which is ourselves and SEAI, to improve the indicators that are there, the indicators on fuel poverty.
So just one comment. It's utterly frustrating. I understand, and I've heard the ESI and the Vincent de Paul, and I've heard MABS, I've heard Traveller MABS, I've heard Age Action Ireland. I've seen their stuff. What you were asked to do was review all this. You can use their empirical evidence and their material, review all this and give us back a report. And you failed to do it. And within days now, the Minister is going to increase carbon tax in the absence of the department doing this piece of work. I'm not asking you to repeat what these women have done, the good work that they have done in Killaton, where fuel poverty lies, how you measure it, the extent of it, possibly the extent, because it isn't an absolute yet. You were asked to give us a report, and you've utterly refused to do so. Now, can you please answer what you're going to do with priority recommendation number 4, which is to give us a measure of what potentially could be raised by a tax on the profits of the fossil fuel and related industries?
Probably finance, sorry. The short answer is, Deputy, my apologies, I don't know what is being done, if anything, on that recommendation, but I would suggest that, you know, companies like those are subject to corporation tax on their profits in the normal course of events, and they're subject to every other tax that's applied across the board.
And the loopholes that go with them.
In relation, you also asked about the increase. If the Minister were to make an increase, yes, the figures you have are broadly in line with what we would expect to raise in terms of an increase in €5 and €10 a tonne. In relation to the mitigating factors, I mean, our tax strategy group paper will set out what the mitigants could be, but as I've said in the past, or as I've said here earlier, you know, these are matters for decision of the Minister and the Government in the context of the budget as to how, if he does decide to increase carbon tax, what he will do with the revenues afterwards.
Okay.
We need to sort out public transport, home retrofitting, just transition, all that's needed with 180 million. Fair play to him. Hats off to Pascal for achieving all that.
Well, again, I mean, it is a long-term project. You know, the committee has talked about going out to €80 a tonne by 2030. That generates a significant amount of revenues.
Okay, well, with respect to you, Mr. Kenny, as the official responsible for indirect taxation, I think we've just proven that this is a punitive tax on the worst off in society without actually achieving anything to mitigate climate chaos. I've just one question to the
Oh yeah, very briefly, because I have to move on.
So the differential between the subjective and the objective measure is there's a couple of things going on there. So let's say you are spending a huge amount of your income net of housing costs heating your swimming pool and your sauna. You know, you technically qualify under definition A as fuel poor, but you're not going to answer that you have difficulty meeting your fuel bills, which is why you don't qualify under the subjective measure. The particular differential for retired single people, I mean, we don't know why 35.8% of them are spending more than 10% of their income on energy and yet aren't reporting that they have difficulty meeting their bills, but presumably it's because their income is such that the remaining 90% is that they can meet their living costs in such a way that they don't feel they can't afford their energy bills. I think the cohort who you're particularly concerned about almost certainly fall into the 5.6% who are reporting that they have difficulty meeting their bills and they also can't access these grants. So I would just again reiterate the point that actually measuring fuel poverty is very difficult and targeting fuel poverty is very difficult, but measuring poverty and targeting poverty is possibly a more salient policy measure that might be one that the committee would like to consider.
I have to move on to Deputy Ryan.
People know